Guys, it's Mark.
And it's Michelle.
This is Mark and Michelle. And
we're continuing our series this evening.
We are. What is it? Why autism can be healed?
It seems like that might be it.
Yeah, that's it. Why autism can be healed. And we're basically kind of debunking the myths around why it can't be healed, right? Last night we talked about neuroplasticity and how the brain changes.
Krista!
And last night we talked about neuroplasticity and how the brain changes. And for those folks,
Marlo, you're awake.
Yay!
Well, except I don't know if that's good or
not. Right? And hopefully it's not insomnia. But last night we talked about neuroplasticity.
Say it 4 times, Mark. Jasmina!
Yay! We're gonna, once we get thousands of people watching, we can't greet everybody.
I know.
But we're gonna greet everybody until we can. So, neuroplasticity was last night. Tonight we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about why autism is not genetic, at least not like you think it is. Again, it appears that.
One-eyed hearing.
For those of you who have a rigid view of genetics, tonight is not your night. So anyway, let's get on with that. I was looking up to familiarize myself with a more general view of autism genetics, only to find out that, truthfully, nobody knows nothing. No, I should say nobody is sure of anything. That's the best way to put it.
It is more grammatically correct.
Well, and more true to what I've read. So we'll go with more grammatically correct and true to what I've read. What I've found is, it was interesting to read that over the past decade or so, since about 2011 up until now, scientific researchers in autism genetics have found that there are about 60-something genes that seem to be strongly linked to autism, and about 200 others that have much weaker links to autism and autism spectrum disorders and that kind of thing. And they've come to find that even the genes that are strongly linked are not predictors of whether you actually get autism. Now, if that doesn't make sense, I'll reword this. Just because you have the genes for autism doesn't necessarily mean you get autism. So that being the case, one thing that they pointed out was, and they were talking about, and I found this to be interesting, you probably will too, is they studied autism in identical twins. And the first study that was done on that was back in 1977. And they found that if, out of identical twins, if one twin had autism, there was approximately an 80% chance that the other twin did too. Now, for those of you who aren't exactly sure what an identical twin is, identical twins come from a single zygote being an egg that's been fertilized by a sperm, and you get a zygote. They combine, you get a zygote. So that zygote then splits and turns into 2 zygotes. And those zygotes then are given birth to as fully formed babies of the same sex and nearly identical genes. One thing I learned in I think it was advanced genetics was that identical twins aren't completely identical. They're about as close as humans can be to clones, but they're not completely identical. Well, Marlo, that's not what they said in these papers that I read. You inherit the risk for autism. You don't inherit the condition. So what that means is,
Marlo said, if you don't get autism, it's passed down. That's for podcasters.
Right. You get past the risk, not the condition. So what that means is you get past the genes and the potentiality of having autism. But, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about, how do you get the condition if you're only past the genes? Well, again, and I'll have to say this too, nobody's sure about anything, even on this. Just because you get the genes, you may not, Ellie, just because you get the genes doesn't mean you get autism. And here's a good example. Give me a second, I'm thinking about something. Okay, my dad, I have half of his genes. And my dad, he had an uncle. This was his mom's uncle, or his mom's brother. So his uncle, his mom's brother. And Uncle Herbert, he had, yes, that's a good way to put it, carriers. And, but Uncle Herbert, he was more like Rain Man. He had autism, even though I don't think he ever had a diagnosis.
Well, did they diagnose back then?
Well, the diagnosis of autism didn't really come around until 1943. And there was a Canadian doctor named, I think he was a doctor, named Leo Kanner. And he came up, I think he coined the word autism back in the early 40s. And so Uncle Herbert may have had a diagnosis, but nobody seems to know. And I'm going to say probably not. Because if he was older than my grandmother, and she was born in 1926, I'm guessing he would have probably been in his late teens or early 20s in 1943 when the word first came around. And not being Canadian, I imagine it wasn't a term that they used here. But Uncle Herbert was more like Rain Man. In other words, his special interest was weather. So you could ask him what was the weather on such and such a day. If he was alive on that day, he remembered the weather and he was right every time. And the only reason I know that is because my dad said that his mom and sisters, they would always ask her what the weather was. And now he wouldn't know the weather on days he hadn't been alive yet, so in the future. But, he would remember the weather on any day he was alive.
But what was interesting is he was married 3 times.
He was married 3 times.
He was married 3 times.
Right? And so being married 3... now,
did they say that his wives kept dying?
I think that was it, because we were with my mom and dad a few weeks
recently
back, and I think he said that. I think my dad said that basically all his wives died.
Yeah.
So he outlived them, which that's unusual.
Yeah.
But anyway, he lived in downtown St. Louis somewhere in an apartment on his own, and so my Uncle Herb, he had autism, pretty sure, and at least listening to the stories. Then my dad didn't get a full-blown case of it. In fact, he has a few traits, but nothing that has impaired his life in that sense. Then I got it. And so the thing is, Uncle Herb was obviously more severe than I was. Listening to the stories and comparing what I know about him to how I live my life. And my whole point on that is, if Uncle Herb had the genes, my dad had the genes, and I had the genes, Uncle Herb and I didn't have the same severity of autism at all. And since that's the case, the genes don't determine whether you get autism, apparently, listening to that. Because if Uncle Herb was more severe than me, and he and I both had nearly the same genes, then it just doesn't make any sense that just because you have the genes, you get the condition. So there are a lot of things that go into...
Can we go back to the twins?
Let's go back to the twins.
What we talked about this afternoon was that the identical twins were more likely to both have it.
Yes.
They came from the same egg and sperm.
Exactly.
So they would have inherited the same metals, the same
damage
they would have been
to the genes by toxins.
Right. Now, you went into fraternal twins with me. You said that's a different egg and a different sperm for each one.
Right.
And they were, if one had it, you said the percentage of the other having it was
40% or less.
So they had different metals, different toxins.
Mm-hmm. And
now I'm thinking of this from a medical medium viewpoint, not that he has said this, but this is just the logic.
And so if fraternal twins have half the same genes, but half the chance of getting it as identical twins, then it isn't really just the genes determining.
Right. You said no. Did you say no one is born with autism?
The latest research says no one is born with the condition. They just inherit the propensity for it.
And we don't think it's genes. We think it's metals. Interesting. Are you fraternal or identical, Sean? Sean has a twin brother.
Yeah.
He is not autistic.
Right.
Fraternal.
So that lends weight to the research. You see what I mean? So so our friend Sean, he said he has a twin brother, a fraternal twin brother, and he is not autistic, but Sean is. Now, Sean's also in the process of recovering, so pretty soon he'll have a fraternal. He'll be the other fraternal twin who isn't autistic either. So that's the thing. It's just like a lot of other diseases, right? In that you may inherit the genes for it, but you don't inherit the condition. You just inherit the genes. Something has to start those genes off in the wrong way to get a genetic condition like that. Now,
my other question would be, how backed up is the liver that the genes are the way they are?
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
You can be sure they hadn't done any research on that.
That would be a big question for
because
me.
That would be medical medium,
right?
You know, a medical medium focus around.
Because he says genes can get messed up because the liver is so backed up, it can't focus on making genes.
Yeah, or keeping the body clean. See, but then we enter the realm of epigenetics.
Right.
Okay. Now, we talked about epigenetics a good bit in evolution, in molecular and cellular biology, in in genetics and advanced genetics, and in advanced molecular and cellular biology. So I've had a good bit of that. Well, and in applied microbiology, oddly enough, and in microbiology. So I've had a good little bit of it. Environmental factors determine how well genes do their job. All right. This is if I remember Dr. Zellers, he was one of my genetics teachers. If I remember this correctly, he says this is the basic premise of molecular and cellular biology. One gene makes one protein. So therefore, and that's all genes do is make proteins. Genes don't make fats. Genes don't make carbohydrates. Genes don't make sugars. Genes only make proteins. Genes only one gene expresses one protein. And if we have about 20 to 30,000 genes, then that means 20 to 30,000 proteins do all of the jobs necessary to produce a human body. That's pretty freaking amazing if you think about it. So my whole point with that is this. When a gene gets affected in how it does its job by heavy metals, or heavy metals, if I remember this correctly, heavy metals disrupt DNA replication. Well, if it interrupts DNA replication, that it means it interrupts how a gene is duplicated, copied. But then other toxins like pesticides, DDT, herbicides, stuff like that, plastics, if they affect how a gene does its job, then let's just assume that any toxins mess up how a gene does its job. So therefore, it doesn't produce the protein exactly the way it needs to be. I think that is a logical way to look at this, because I'm sure that's exactly how we would have looked at it in all those classes I took. So if junk messes around with how a gene makes a protein, then that protein is not going to be correct for the job it's supposed to do. And if that's the case, then you can be sure that that protein is not going to accomplish what it needs to accomplish. Now, so far, and the reason I went through the whole one gene makes one protein is that so far they have not found one single gene that is responsible for the conditions of autism. So that means there isn't just one gene. Well, we said that at the beginning of this thing. 60-something genes strongly correlated with the autism spectrum disorders, and about 200 more weakly connected with autism spectrum disorders, right? But there is not just one gene that you can say causes autism, right? They have not found that. So when you say it's in my genes, you don't know what genes are, you don't know what proteins are, you don't know what epigenetics is, you haven't even read the least recent science on genes and autism. If you say that, you're spouting crap. I'm just going to say it. That's exactly what you're doing, and you're not scientifically literate.
Well,
So,
in medical medium says you can change your genes.
Well, you can change the conditions
The
that your
conditions.
genes, you can change the condition, and it's not just medical medium. Let me quote a guy who was a molecular and cellular biologist back in the 1960s, right? Before they knew what stem cells were, all right? A guy named Bruce Lipton. He says that the conditions in your body at any one point control how your genes express. Now, you think that sounds like bunk? Here you go. Cortisol. Let's see. Other stress hormones. Couldn't think of them right now. But then when you set up stressful conditions in your body, all of those stressful hormones and chemicals in your body affect how your genes express. That's what he says. That he is a scientist, and I believe that, right? He says, but if you set up good, positive, healthy conditions in your body, then those genes express properly. Those genes express properly, and therefore you have a healthier body. Now, it isn't just that. Epigenetics also talks about nutrition, but it talks about environmental toxins, like we've talked about, heavy metals, plastics,
Radiation.
Radiation. That's a good one, which I forgot about. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so all of those, the environment that your genes live in determines how well your genes do their job, and the resulting proteins.
And it's not just physical, it's what kind of emotions are you sitting in?
Just like I said, just like Bruce Lipton talks about. So positive emotions actually positively affect your genes. Negative emotions, stressful ones, detrimentally affect your genes. There's a word for you, detrimentally. I wonder how many syllables that is. But anyway.
5.
Okay, thank you. But that's why it is so important to get the right nutrition. That's why you can, again, it goes back to last night where we talked about autism being hardwired. If your genes aren't hardwired, nothing is hardwired. Nothing. If your genes can be affected by anything, by something, then they can be negatively, then they can be positively affected by something too. If that's the case, then that means you can heal.
Yes.
So I'm sure he does. We haven't heard Joe Dispenza in a long time. Our friend Jasmina says Joe Dispenza talks about that as well. He does. And so give me a break on the autism is in my genes.
and I can't change it.
Right. The propensity for it might be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you were fated to get it. Right? Who knows how many people out there carrying around autism genes?
Who don't have it.
Who don't actually, because I've met whole families that have it, and I've met families who the mother has it, a daughter, or two sons and a dad, or a daughter and a dad. I've met every combination. So you are not fated to get autism, and you're not fated to have it the rest of your life. So give me a break with that crap, and do your science before you talk to me, right? Or do your science before you let me overhear your conversation when you say that. All right. So, all right, guys, that is our show for
Heavy metal detox smoothie.
yeah, celery juice and the lemon water, and www.healyourautism.com/buy the book, and you'll find all the freebies that go with it, and you'll love the book, and it'll get you started to getting where we're at today.
And we also do coaching.
We do. And message us here if you want to take advantage of that, because it will really help you. All right, guys.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.